it's that I like puns. One reason I know this is because whenever family or friends send me email forwards, most of the time they are a list of puns. They usually include the words, "I thought of you" when I read these. My brother Rob recently sent me such a forward. Two of the puns were especially fitting. One of them dealing with religion, another one dealing with dentistry. Did you hear about the cannibals who ate a Christian missionary? They wanted to get a taste of religion. And did you hear about the Buddhist monk who refused Novocaine when getting a root canal? Apparently he wanted to transcend dental medication. Of course, not all people enjoy my puns, and sometimes they don't even get them. For instance, once I was teaching a high school Sunday school class. We were discussing the miracles of Jesus, and so I asked them, does anyone know what Jesus' most surprising miracle was? No one offered an answer, and so I replied, Jesus' most surprising miracle was that he once cured a ham. All of the kids looked at me with a very confused expression on their face, until finally one of the kids spoke up on behalf of the entire group and said, I don't get it. And while I can certainly laugh at those kids for not getting my bad pun, the truth is, I too have been in that same position before. Someone shares a joke. Some of the people start breaking out in laughter, whereas I get this puzzled look on my face and sheepishly admit, I don't get it. This morning, as we look at our gospel lesson, the first thing I notice is that Jesus is speaking in parables. In fact, he shares two of them. And when I consider what Jesus says about parables, it occurs to me that puns and parables have some things in common. Both may be very clever, but sometimes there are people who simply will not get them. In fact, Jesus guarantees that some people will not understand his parables. When discussing this matter, Jesus tells the disciples, to you has been given the secret of the kingdom of God, but for those outside, everything comes in parables, in order that they may indeed look, but not perceive, and may indeed listen, but not understand. And when preaching on the parables, I freely admit it, I quickly turn to biblical scholars to read their thoughts. No doubt, certain parables seem easier to understand. However, we know that Jesus added layers of meaning to these stories, ones that I often don't see. This morning, I would like to express my appreciation to Pastor Brian Stoffregen, whose insights into our second parable have helped me to understand it in a new light. Consequently, it is that second story that I would like to focus on this morning, hoping that some of these thoughts will prove beneficial to all of you as well. To begin, Pastor Stoffregen reminds us that Jesus' parables are more than just quaint little stories with quaint little messages. They are oftentimes disturbing stories that are meant to challenge the assumptions of the listeners. When looking at any parable, he suggests that we begin by asking the question, what in our world of assumptions might Jesus be seeking to threaten today? With that question in mind, let us turn to the second parable, the familiar parable of the mustard seed, in which Jesus tells us that the kingdom of God is like a mustard seed, which, when sown upon the ground, is the smallest of all the seeds on earth. Yet, when it is sown, it grows up and becomes the greatest of all shrubs and puts forth large branches so that the birds of the air can make nests in its shade. While the traditional interpretation focuses on the smallness of the seed, Stoffregen suggests that we concentrate on another element in the story, the actual mustard plant. After all, if Jesus was simply wanting to make the point that the kingdom of God starts out small and grows into something much larger, something that gives shade to the birds of the air, he could have easily chosen any number of seeds. Even more, if he only wanted to emphasize the growth and the size of the kingdom, he might have done better to mention the mighty cedars of Lebanon, which were also mentioned in our psalm today. While those seeds are somewhat larger, in the end, mustard plants grow to only about 10 feet tall, whereas the mighty cedars of Lebanon grow well beyond 100 feet tall. But clearly that is not what Jesus chose to do. Instead, he compared God's kingdom to a mustard seed, which in turn becomes a mustard plant, a plain, ordinary bush, one that was found everywhere in Palestine. And according to Stoffregen, there is one other significant fact about mustard plants. It is actually described as a weed, one that has dangerous takeover properties. In other words, once it starts to grow in an area, it spreads all over the place. Pastor Stoffregen compares it to crabgrass in our day. And when we see the parable in this light, God's kingdom is a weed. God's kingdom is like crabgrass. It not only threatens our preconceived notions, but it also offends our sensibilities. After all, people in Jesus' day who had looked forward to the kingdom of God, one that would match the military might of King David's reign, one that would rival the affluence of King Solomon's rule. We too expect God's kingdom to have some demonstration of worldly greatness. But rather than this powerful, majestic kingdom of God, one that could be compared to the mighty cedars of Lebanon, Jesus tells us that God's kingdom instead is like a tiny mustard seed, one that becomes a persistent, pervasive weed. And while that thought may be somewhat troubling to us, the more I reflect on it, the more I find it to be true. And the more I find it to be a comforting image. After all, when Jesus came to earth, he did not predominantly gather around the social elites. Instead, he associated with the poor, the forgotten, the sick, the outcast. In other words, the weeds of society, reminding them and everyone else that the kingdom of God had a special place for the likes of them. To close, I would like to share with you one final image. As an expert on weeds, since that is the only thing I have ever been able to grow, I have observed something fascinating about them. As you walk out of the church this morning, I invite you to take a closer look as you go through the parking lot. As you likely have already noticed, we have a concrete parking lot. One that has large square blocks. Between those blocks are small spaces or cracks. It is into those spaces that I invite you to look. Because sure enough, in those cracks, you will discover weeds. Ones that have just enough room to sprout and to grow. And it occurs to me that the exact same thing is true about the kingdom of God. Into the cracks of our lives where we are broken. Into the midst of those small spaces in our world where things seem desperate. There is always enough room for the kingdom of God to begin breaking through. Offering forgiveness to the sinner. Offering hope to those who are despairing. Offering God's unconditional love to us all.